Hey guys, welcome to The Grey Escape. I'm Natalie Gray and we have a great episode lined up today. I'll tell you all about it right after this. If you need to send money overseas and transfer currencies, go to thegreyescape.com/cash to learn how you can save up to 90% on international money transfer fees and get the best currency conversion rates, even beating out companies like PayPal. That's thegreyescape.com/cash. Any currency, anywhere in the world, and you can save a bundle. So, time for today's guest. Super excited for today. If you guys have already listened to earlier episodes of The Grey Escape, like episodes 29 and 30, the holographic episodes, you will be very familiar with today's guest, British writer and researcher Anthony Peake, who is an expert on fringe areas of human consciousness. Cool stuff like near-death experiences, the afterlife, altered states, gateways to higher consciousness, and much more. Anthony has a brand new book out called Opening the Doors of Perception. I'm massively stoked to bring this guy to you today, so we're going to dive straight in with the holographic man himself, Anthony Peake. As I just learned while we were setting up the mics, your book, Opening the Doors of Perception, has just come out, and you're already writing another book.
Another two.
Two.
I'm finishing off a book on J.B. Priestley, the British playwright. And also because the response to this book has been so good, the new book, Opening the Doors of Perception, my publisher has already approached me and given me an advance for the sequel.
Wow.
Which will be out in the middle of next year, called Through the Doors of Perception. So Daniel Pinchbeck wrote a wonderful review of it a couple of days ago as well, which is really good. So building up, it's quite exciting.
I mean, just on the book writing front then, so you've written the book Opening the Doors of Perception. How is it that there's even more stuff for a similar book? Don't you just kind of write everything there is to write in that one book?
Well, I suppose the analogy of doors is a perfect one, in the sense that you're one side of a door, and then you go through the door to the other side. And the new book is going to be Through the Doors of Perception. So what it will be an approach of understanding when we have these experiences, are they real? And the entities we perceive or see or interface with in these alternate states of consciousness, are they real?
Right.
How do we define real? So, for instance, I'm very interested in the writings of a French ufologist called Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée, back in the 1960s and 70s, wrote a series of books, the main one being Passport to Magonia. Interesting background, Magonia, there was an archbishop in the 13th century in France, and they captured what they called a sky sailor. And this sky sailor came out of a flying object. And the sky sailor explained to the people in this French village that he was from another place, another planet called Magonia. And from then onwards, they were always looking to the skies to see people coming from Magonia. And Jacques Vallée argues that these creatures, whatever they are, these entities, have been with us since the earliest possible times. And we misinterpret them as being aliens from outer space, whereas he argues they're from inner space. And he links fairies and goblins and hobgoblins and everything else in the same way, that they're all the same phenomenon.
It rings a bell reading something about this Magonia, and isn't one of the other theories also that it's a time traveller or somebody from a multiverse where parts of our planet was actually called Magonia instead of, say, China? It was another timeline.
Yes. There are certain, like the islands, there are certain islands that are considered to be somewhere floating islands or islands in the distance as well, that people believe are places where other beings come from. And it's been around for such a long time. I mean, for instance, one of the really great books on this is Project Trojan Horse by John Keel. And Project Trojan Horse, again, puts forward the same idea that alien entities are manifestations of our own subconscious. They're Jungian archetypes almost, which, again, we can touch on later if you wish. But the whole idea is that it is far more complex and far more interesting than just the idea that these creatures travel through interstellar space, crossing hundreds of light years, which is scientifically, as far as we understand science to be anyway, impossible. So where are they coming from? And why is it that there are such physical similarities between classic aliens and entities like goblins? For example, I did an interview with Whitley Strieber about 3 or 4 months ago, 5 months ago.
And for people who are unfamiliar, can you explain who he is?
Yeah, Whitley Strieber was a very, very popular American science fiction and horror writer. He wrote stories like The Wolfen and The Hunger, and various other very, very popular films, novels that were made into fairly popular movies. I mean, Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie, for instance, played the two characters in The Hunger. And Wolfen was hugely popular. And because he'd made so much money, he bought himself a log cabin up in upstate New York. And he was staying in the log cabin sometime, I think, in the early 70s. I'm not sure of the exact dates now. But he was staying there, and he had an encounter with aliens. He had an encounter with greys. And he subsequently discovered that these entities had been with him since his childhood. And they had been part of his life since childhood. And he was involved in some fairly gruesome experiments they did with him and everything else. And he wrote a book about this called Communion, which came out, I think, in the late 1970s. And the front cover of the book Communion had this image of an alien, the aliens that he encountered. And the alien image is now what is the typical standard image of a grey. You know, it's the huge black eyes, the slit for a mouth, and the two holes for the nostrils. And over the years, Whitley has been intrigued by what exactly was taking place, and he's written a series of books. Communion. They made Communion into a movie. Christopher Walken took him off in the movie. And it's a very, very intriguing movie because the sequels, he then wrote something called Confirmation and something else. I mean, he follows quite a Catholic theme, so he goes through these kind of ideas because he's a practicing Catholic as well, so he brings in this kind of religious aspect as well, which is quite intriguing. But he's interviewed me 2 or 3 times, and what really was interesting was that around about 6 or 7 years ago now, he was in a hotel room in Montreal, and he was visited by an entity that he describes as being the master of the key. And this entity told him some incredibly strange things, which led him to believe that whatever the entities are, they are not aliens from outer space. They are far more complex than this. And when he interviewed me for his own radio program, he was so intrigued in the things I was saying, particularly in terms of the explanations I am giving with my work for these experiences, that he offered to write the foreword of the new book.
Wow.
And as you now know, the new book, the foreword, is by Whitley Strieber.
Yeah.
And Whitley is incredibly complimentary of the work I'm doing because I'm pushing the envelope in so many different directions, and I'm bringing in so many different areas of human inquiry into everything. So, for instance, my next book will be about alien encounters and UFOs.
What were some of the weird things that the aliens apparently said to Whitley? That they said strange things, which made him think.
The master of the key made some predictions and various other things that led him to believe that they are far more entwined with us, that they are part of us in some way. Now, again, if you go back to Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychotherapist, Carl Gustav Jung argued that the way human personality works and how it functions is that we have deep within ourselves things called archetypes. And archetypes are kind of symbols that appear in our dreams. Like, for instance, you'll have the hag and the guide and the joker and various other things. But he also said that there are other archetypes as well, like symbols, like the mandala is a symbol that is found across most societies and symbolizes very similar things. And he believed that these things are something that carry through deep in what he calls the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious is the race memory of humanity. So in other words, we all have a consciousness which interfaces with reality. We then have a subconscious, which are all the hopes and fears that are sublimated, that we don't fully understand in our everyday life. Then there is this collective unconscious, which wells up during dreams. And Jung was able to explain from this the idea of how we have past life recall and everything else. I mean, I was fascinated to discover recently there was a series of experiments done with young birds. And they just hatched, they were hatchlings. And you place hatchlings in a nest, and you place them in a laboratory. And if you fly over a cardboard cutout of an eagle, they cower. They've never had any interface with eagles ever before. They would know nothing about, but they generate fear instantaneously. Now, this could explain why a lot of us have irrational fears of snakes. These are archetypes. These are things that are in the collective unconscious. And Jung argues that at a deeper level of reality, we are all one single entity, and that's the collective unconscious. Now, within that, the archetypes that Jung talks about, one of the archetypes is the disc, or the symbol of the disc, which is a symbol of eternity. But I think in 1959, he wrote a book on UFOs called Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky. And he again draws the conclusions that these are far deeper part of our psyche in a much more bizarre and strange way than the straightforward example of how we interpret them as being UFOs. And of course, the only reason we interpret them as being UFOs, as being spaceships, is it's because of our culture. Our culture will perceive something that looks like that as being a spaceship. In the 1890s, there was a flap in America where they were airships. Before that, they were skyships. The creatures that were there were considered to be from heaven. They were considered, you go back into biblical times, the vision of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel sees effectively a flying disc, and he encounters entities. These, again, are the way in which society will always try to explain extraordinary experiences, taking into account their own technology. And as you rightly said, we're now moving forward away from the idea of aliens being from some star systems, thousands of light years away, to being something far closer to ourselves. So then we get into the ever its many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, the idea that there are multiple universes literally next door to ourselves, that creatures or entities can come through from one reality to another. Now, if this is the case, we then start tying into things like poltergeists, ghosts, spirit encounters. Again, as an example, Aleister Crowley, the magician, many, many years ago, claimed that he manifested entities, and one of them was called Aiwass. And if you look at the pictures that he drew of Aiwass, it's Whitley Strieber's grey. So again, these creatures have, the eyes are bigger, with Whitley Strieber, but that's the only real difference with Aiwass. And Aiwass was an entity that they manifested using ritual magic. So again, do we bring about, are these elements of our own personalities that we can draw up? Are they elements, demonic possession, multiple personality syndrome? All these are areas I'm interested in. Now, the reason that I'm fascinated on this is that I don't know how far you've got in the book, but there's a section when I describe something called Charles Bonnet syndrome.
I'm at about page 80.
Okay, fine. You probably will have not got there yet. Charles Bonnet syndrome. Charles Bonnet was a French psychologist around about the 1790s, something like that. And his father or his grandfather started to claim that he was seeing entities, he was seeing beings around him. And Bonnet started to do research in this and discovered that this wasn't uncommon with people who are partially sighted or people who are elderly. And they see little creatures. Now, the reason I'm talking about Charles Bonnet syndrome here is because of a very, very peculiar event that I cite in the book that took place with my own mother. I am originally from the Wirral, which is in the northwest of England. Okay, and my mother, until recently, lived on a relatively isolated village called Bromber Pool. And around about, probably about 8 years ago now, she was walking onto the village with my aunt. Now, they're both widows. Okay, so they became friendly to each other, my father's sister and my mother. And They're both partially sighted. My mother lost her eye with malignant melanoma in her late 50s, and they had to take the eye out because it would have killed her. And she lost her eye, and it's unbelievable. They replaced the eye with a glass eye, which moves. You can't tell. It's just amazing. But anyway, my aunt had stopped to tie her shoelace. And as she stopped, she leaned forward, leaving my mother just looking into space. And my mother was looking over in the general direction of Liverpool and the Mersey River. And there's an old factory near the village. And she phoned me up the next day to describe this. And she said, I looked over your Auntie Audrey and I looked into the distance. And in the sky was a smoke disc, a disc of smoke. And it was revolving. And she said, and it was pulsating. And then she said, it then shot off at incredible speed towards North Wales. Now, an aside to this story is that I posted this on Facebook about 2 or 3 years ago, soon after it happened. And I was contacted fairly quickly afterwards by a Facebook friend of mine called Morrigan Hawkins. And Morrigan lives on the Wirral.
Can I just say, everything in your life sounds like it was in The Hobbit. Like everywhere you've lived and your friends, Morrigan Hawkins. It's like that's a character that has long, spindly fingers.
Morrigan has a great name, doesn't she? Absolutely, absolutely. She, in fact, attended a talk I did at Liverpool Library about 2 months ago on this book. She turned up with my friend of mine, Richard. But anyway, she's travelling across what was known as the White Bridge, which is a bridge that crosses something called the Dibben River.
Again.
The Dibben. It is, isn't it?
The Dibben.
The Dibben, absolutely. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Very Tolkien-esque.
Yes.
And there's links here to Tolkien, by the way. We can spin off to Tolkien.
See, I'm picking up on it,
absolutely,
aren't I? With all these
aren't
crazy places you're from.
Absolutely. The Hobbits of Wirral.
So Morrigan.
Morrigan with her hairy feet. She'll hate me for that. She doesn't have hairy feet, by the way.
I think she does, Morrigan.
I wouldn't even... How would I possibly know that she'd had hairy feet, Unless she goes.
We could go on such a tangent right now on Morrigan.
We're off on a tangent. She'll love this. Anyway, going back to the idea, she was crossing the White Bridge. Another one, the White Bridge. She was crossing the White Bridge.
Right. And she met the rabbit.
And they went down the hole.
Right.
And how far could you go? So she's crossing the White Bridge in a taxi with a friend. And they see this disc fly over. So there was proof that it was in external reality. It was in consensual reality. It had been witnessed outside of my mother's worldview. So anyway, my mother rings me up the next day and I explain to her and I say, no, it was obviously something you just saw, a military aircraft, who knows, weird cloud, I don't know, because my mother's not into UFOs. She never has been. It's not something she's interested in. Anyway, 10 days later or so, she rings me up one morning, hysterical, absolutely hysterical. She'd woke up in the middle of the night before, and she normally closes her bedroom door. The bedroom door was open. Now, she was in a state of sleep paralysis. Now, sleep paralysis is when you're asleep, when you're awake, but the sleep world seems to impose itself on three-dimensional reality around you. And you're also paralyzed because there's something called REM intrusion, which is the technical term for it, but also you're paralyzed because the body, in order to protect yourself when you are asleep and you have a dream like you're fighting Muhammad Ali or something, you start punching and kicking out. Because you're paralyzed, you can't do that, so you can't damage yourself or anybody sleeping with you. So it's a protection technique.
Right.
But if you wake up in this REM intrusion state, you will feel paralyzed. Now, ordinarily in REM intrusion state, you also have an archetype, again, a Jungian archetype called the hag, because people will describe seeing in the corner of the bedroom, in profile, somebody with a cowled figure sitting in the darkness.
I've had this, by the way, this exact sleep paralysis and
you
woken
saw the
up.
same thing?
I saw the hag, but she was hovering over me, a horrible, vile, ugly woman. And it was one of the most terrifying things. This was over 20 years ago, but I'll always remember it. She was spitting on me and her saliva was suspended like right above me, that she was spitting down on me. It was horrible and terrifying.
Joanna Rotten.
I think it was Morrigan. Is that her name?
Yes, it probably was. Probably was, yeah. Because that's intriguing in itself. So the location was above you, which is unusual but not unknown. Now, again, this is a Jungian archetype, because I said a Jungian archetype is the hag, And sometimes you'll have a pressure on your chest as if something's sitting on your chest. And again, if you look at the classic painting by Henry Fuseli, the Swiss-British artist, there's a painting called The Nightmare. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a lady on a bed and she's got this thing sitting on her chest.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And it's a very good painting, and it's very jokey because if you look in the corner, there's a window open and there's a white horse putting its head through the door. The window, that's the nightmare.
Okay.
So he's being clever and silly. But anyway, so my mother is in this state, and she said she looked towards the door, and as she looked at the door, she noticed it was open, and then this series of spindly fingers came round the door, and this creature popped its head round. And my mother said it recognised me. It blinked and realised I was there and dodged its head back. But it's how she described it. And she said it was about 4 foot tall. And she said it had a huge grey face, huge black insect eyes, 2 little nostrils and a slit for a mouth. And she's telling me this and shivers are going up my spine because I'm like, oh my God, it's a classic grey. It's the cover of Whitley Strieber's book, literally. Now, my mother wouldn't know Whitley Strieber. She's not into UFOs. The only alien she would ever even vaguely know is E.T., who doesn't look anything like that. So, there's no way she was linking anything.
Could she have seen the cover of the book at your house or something?
No, because I don't think I ever had that copy of that book at my home because I read it after I left home to go to university. So I don't think it would ever have been the circumstances. So things then start getting seriously strange because I calm her down and I say, don't worry, Mum, really don't worry because it's not, it's just something in your mind. And I try to explain REM intrusion and sleep paralysis and explain everything because she's an ex-nurse, so she would appreciate the neurological aspects, so she vaguely could understand that. Anyway, I went round to see her a few days later and I'm chatting to her and she turned around right out the blue and she goes, the children are really bothering me these days. And I said, what children? And she said, the children that sing to me. And I'm going, what children are these, Mum? Thinking she's letting children into the house. And she said, no, they're always around me. They're little creatures. They look like little fairy creatures, but I think they're children. And they sing in this high-pitched voice. And they follow me. And they follow me when I'm shopping. And when I was home, they were sitting and looking around me when I'm sitting watching television. And then she said, they're very friendly and they're very nice, but they're not as nice as the old man in the kitchen. And I go, right, who's this, Mum? She said, oh, there's an elderly gentleman in the kitchen. He's always very nice. He smiles at me a lot. He never speaks, but he smiles and he nods. Now, I'm thinking, is she allowing people in the house or not? But my knowledge of Charles Bonnet syndrome was sufficient, and I thought, this sounds like Charles Bonnet syndrome, particularly with the alien encounter as well. So I started reading up, and I discovered there are direct links between Charles Bonnet syndrome and the development of Alzheimer's. So immediately the warning bells go. And my mother had been doing odd other things as well. So I took her off to the doctor, and I told the doctor, and I said, I think she's got Charles Bonnet syndrome. I think it's linked to the fact that she's partially sighted, but I also think it's linked to the fact she's developing Alzheimer's. And we got the diagnosis, and she had got Alzheimer's, and she's now catatonic. Okay, so it's very, very sad. And she's now, we can talk about how I link Alzheimer's in the new book to various other states of mind. But it is clear here that whatever is taking place in terms of Charles Bonnet syndrome, it seems to be a breakthrough from Magonia into this reality. And that the doors of perception of my mother have been opened by what I argue is the destruction of her microtubules in her brain. Because in my previous book, The Infinite Mind Field, I just discussed something called OR, which is Orchestrated Objective Reduction, which is a theory put forward by Professor Stuart Hammerhoff, who was an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, and a British mathematician called Roger Penrose. And the two of them come together and said that consciousness is created in the brain by quantum physics. And that there are very, very small structures within the neurons of the brain called microtubules. They are structures of tubulin that actually make the fibers inside the neurons rigid. And these very, very tiny structures are so small, there are literally billions of them in every neuron. Wow. And they are so small that they would be affected by quantum effects.
So we have billions of neurons already, right, in our
Yeah.
brains. And so you're saying every single neuron has billions of these microtubules.
And microtubules are very, very curious structures in the sense that they're hollow inside and they give off single photons of light either side, which effectively means that they can create interference patterns inside them. Interference patterns like holograms. And if we've got billions and billions, trillions of these things in our brain, Hammerhoff and Penrose argue that this is our reality modulator. The external reality is a hologram, and the hologram is projected outwards by the microtubules, okay, which we can go into in a slightly more detail. So this is starting to explain how reality works, how reality is a holographic generation. Now, what happens with Alzheimer's is there's something called tau. And a tau is a kind of it's a substance that destroys the microtubules. It blows them apart. It literally destroys them. So when somebody is developing Alzheimer's, what's happening is the microtubules in the brain are being shattered. So it's rather like you have a radio that attunes you to the world, and it's been destroyed by these things inside your head.
Or it's being slightly shifted
or
to a new channel.
Changed, and it's being rechanneled, which means that the vibration state, the vibrations that we attune reality to, the electromagnetic waves that we perceive, whatever analogy we use, I argue that people, when they develop Alzheimer's, the tuning starts to go awry.
Right.
And they start to perceive, it's like a radio station. You know,
Right.
you retune it and you get different radio
I
stations.
just said that.
You did. You beat me to it. It's a great analogy. Yeah, absolutely. So that was very impressive.
I have read
You
your
never
book.
cease to amaze me. No, that sounds like an insult,
I
doesn't
was
it?
inspired by your book.
Oh, great. That's good. So anyway, so there's the tuning in that's going on for the tuning off. Now, what becomes stranger and stranger, and the way these ideas and these concepts are starting to resonate as an explanator of reality, is that one of my publisher, Watkins Books, and one of my publishers, Watkins Books, a fellow author on Watkins Books, is a lady called Maggie Latourelle. And Maggie Latourelle has brought out a book called The Gift of Alzheimer's. Fascinating book, well worth reading, and she would make a wonderful guest for you, by the way. I've interviewed her myself a couple of times, and I've got interviews for her in the future. Maggie's mother started developing Alzheimer's, lives up in northern Scotland, and Maggie decided to keep a journal of her mother as her mother deteriorated into Alzheimer's. So what starts as just a journal of I went up to see my mother starts to go into very, very strange areas. Because as her mother started to develop deeper and deeper into Alzheimer's, she started describing what was happening to her. And she'd turn around to Maggie and she'd say, "Oh, the entities are tuning my brain.
Wow.
They're retuning me. They visit me and they're retuning me." And then she'd turn around and she'd say, "Oh yeah, your sister visited me, and so and so, and these are all dead people." And she's saying, "Oh, they came to see me." And the entities weren't too happy with them visiting me. But then things started to take a turn for the really damn weird. Maggie lives in London, and she was planning to visit her mother up in Western Scotland. And I think it was a Friday afternoon or something, and she was talking to her friend about she was going to be driving up or catching the train. And her friend says, "Well, where does your mum live?" And she said, "Well, she used to live, she had a house in west of Glasgow." And they got Google Maps up. They put Google Maps up, and they have the satellite photograph of her mother's house. And in the drive is her mother's Mini that her mother hadn't had for quite a few years, which made them realise that it was years ago. So they have this joke about how out of date it can be. She travels up. She goes into the home, goes into her mother's room. Her mother's facing the window, and as she walks in, she goes, "My Mini," talking about my Mini. And they go, and Maggie goes, "What?" Her mother knew. She went up one time to sort out her father's paperwork, and they went to see solicitors. She went to see her mother in the afternoon. "I want to be involved in these meetings. You can't have the meetings without me." Maggie then had problems with her teeth. I think it was her teeth. And she went and her mother said, "Maggie, pains in her teeth, pains in her teeth." She had so many examples of clearly telepathy going on. And as she goes further on, she said one statement where she said, they're trying to attune my 4 sections of my brain to resonate correctly.
Wow.
And then she said, I'm ready now they're getting me ready to move on. I'm being prepared to move on. And soon afterwards, she died. Now, to me, this is again powerful, powerful evidence that Alzheimer's facilitates opening the doors of perception. Now, things then, you start to put pieces together. As you know, in my work, things just seem to fall into place because there is something called Retrogenesis or Retrogenesis. I'm never quite sure how it's pronounced. I was in a meeting recently and one of the members of the audience was a professor of astronomy. I can't remember his name now. Bernard Carr. And I mentioned retrogenesis, and he was asking me questions afterwards, and he called it retrogenesis. So I need to be careful of my pronunciations. I'm
sure they're both correct.
I'm sure they must be. And retrogenesis was put forward by a guy called Barry Reisberg. By the way, if everybody thinks I've got a load of notes in front of me, I haven't. I've got witnesses here that I haven't.
I've got notes. Anthony has no notes.
No notes.
Just a great memory.
It's just a weird memory. And Barry Reisberg in 1984 came up with this idea of retrogenesis or retrogenesis or retrogenesis or retrogenesis. That's nice, not being silly. He noticed that if you do a chart of how a child develops from birth and the different things that they go through as they develop, and then you overlay that, the reverse of somebody who is getting old and getting towards death, and particularly somebody with Alzheimer's, it mirror images. It's as if one is going down to then go up again, as if we're moving towards a rebirth situation. And I was enthralled by this because I was in a queue at Tesco's a few months ago, and there was a newly born baby. And I looked at the newly born baby. The mother had it there. It wasn't just lying in the aisle, it was just underneath the Farley's rusks or something.
Right.
Or there was a stork there, But there was a lady there with their child. And I looked at this child, and the way it was looking and moving around, the way its eyes were moving, I was intrigued because I thought, it's just like my mother. It's just how my mother reacts to the world because she's virtually catatonic. Her eyes will follow you, maybe. Sometimes her eyes won't even follow you, but she can't speak, she can't communicate. So her communication channels are now completely cut. Wherever she is, she's not there anymore. The signal is not coming through. The radio, the consciousness that vitiates the radio has been lost.
Right.
She's not there. Whereas a baby, it seems that the baby's starting to tune in as if whoever is going to be the baby is sort of slowly being drawn up or drawn down into the consciousness area. Again, as an aside, quite intriguing. I'm reading my first book for Audible, for an Audible book, an audio book that will be coming out next year. And I was rereading some sections of this. And in the first book, which I wrote 10 years ago, I have a section on Solomon Shereshevsky, who was a memory man. He forgot nothing. Everything in his life he remembered. And in the 1930s, a guy called Alexander Luria, who was a Russian Soviet psychologist, worked with him and tested him out in terms of his memories. And this guy remembered right to almost the time after his birth. And one of the things I said in the book, which I wish I'd remembered for the new book, was that Shereshevsky describes how he used to see his mother coming into focus. Everything was like a blur, and suddenly this face would appear, and then she'd move away and go out of focus again. Now, it was only in the late 1960s they discovered something about the way babies see. A baby is born, and the eye, the mechanism of the eye is perfect. So there's no reason why a baby can't see in sharp focus. But apparently some of the mechanisms of the focusing within the eye can't develop properly, and they only discovered this then. So what Shereshevsky actually described there was absolutely accurate, which to me was absolute vindication that he wasn't making it up. He really, really could go back to the earliest time of his childhood. So this guy remembered everything. So here again, we have evidence of how the human brain functions and how it is that there is linkage between Alzheimer's and being a child. But also there's other links here, because you then start to spin out. And Charles Bonnet syndrome is something that some other people experience. People who have classic migraine. And I get classic migraine, but I've never, ever had Charles Bonnet syndrome. I have all the other classic symptoms, but not Charles Bonnet syndrome. But I started to read up about migraine and Charles Bonnet syndrome, and I found there's a direct link. And there's an American writer called Siri Husfeld. And she is a classic migrainer, and she had been experiencing seeing little people since she was a child.
Wow.
And again, if anybody's interested in checking up on this, the late Oliver Sacks, his very last book was called Hallucinations, and he has a whole section on Charles Bonnet syndrome, which I cite in the book, which again seems to me that the doors of perception are opened by certain neurochemicals in the brain.
So, I mean, basically, if you have a migraine, then according to your book, and it seems actually quite logical then, if we subscribe to the transistor radio theory of tuning, that the migraine's just opening up more awareness to other channels. So you're suddenly getting a different reality where there might be the little people, that kind of thing. That's
Yes.
what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that because we were very much talking about the new book, but that's exactly what the route I'm going to take with the new book is, well, if the doors of perception are open, that we can experience Magonia, what exactly are we experiencing in Magonia? For example, if my mother, the entity that my mother saw, seemed to react to her, it seemed to realize that she'd seen it, which leads you to believe that there is motivation and thought and perceptions going on in something that technically is a creation of your own mind. But now we then come down to the really big issue where we turn around and we say, hallucinations are creations of the mind. Well, how can that be? How can my mind create something in external reality that seems to me an external reality that is not motivated by me and what I want to see? In other words, my mother didn't think, you know what, I'd like to have a dream tonight and I want to see a grey.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems that the narrative and the storyline of what she perceived suggested that what she was perceiving was something real out there.
Yeah.
Now, it is known, for instance, that hallucinations can be defined, and the standard definition of an hallucination is something that you perceive through your senses, normally your sight, or it could be sound, that seems to be in the external world that nobody else sees. And that is the definition, and the only definition of it. If you and I both see Morrigan Hawkins walk through the door here, sorry Morrigan, we're at it again, and we see an image of her,
Right.
that is then considered to be a folie à deux. In other words, two people have shared an hallucination. You read books on psychiatry and psychology, and they will describe that with all seriousness, without ever realizing that they're explaining an extraordinary experience
Right.
with telepathy. Because the only way you can explain a folie à deux, two people share the same hallucination, is that they are in some way in contact. But you read books about modern psychology, there's no way they would accept that telepathy exists.
Well, I'd explain it a third way, that the thing's actually there.
Yeah, and the thing is actually there. And there is an alternate level of reality where the thing is actually
Right.
there, and you are both seeing it.
Right.
Now, if this is the case, what is it? What exactly are hallucinations? Most people will say we know what they are, but they don't. Because we have to take this one step further. Because the reality you are now perceiving, by the very definition that neurologists and psychologists use, is also an hallucination, in that it is created by your brain inside your head from incoming stimuli from your senses. What you see and what is really out there is not a one-to-one relationship. People who believe that are called naive realists, the idea that the world is as I see it. It isn't.
So most people are naive realists.
Most people
like
are naive.
99.99999% of the population are naive realists.
They are.
Right.
And it's the most simple and logical way. You know, that if we both... the reason that this reality we consider real is that you and I are consensually agreeing that this is real. So you see a pink elephant come through the door, and I see a pink elephant. We've agreed there's a pink elephant there. We are consensual, therefore that is external reality. When we have collective delusions, then there's big problems. But the big thing that fascinates me is that Celia Green and her associate came together a few years ago, and they came up with a model of reality called a metachoric model of reality. And the metachoric model is that we can explain hallucinations simply. Everything we perceive is an hallucination, including consensual reality. And the baseline of everything is consciousness. And consciousness is what brings about perceptions and external reality. If we start to then think along those lines, some of the really big questions start to go away. The big questions about consciousness. How does consciousness occur in a brain? How is it that electricity reacting with matter in my brain can create me, can create you, can create the listeners? Every single listener that's listening to this now will realize that they are perceiving something. They are something inside their head that's perceiving something. But we don't know the location of that something, and we don't know how that comes about. Because if you break down the brain to its basic situation, you have molecules which are inanimate and dead. You bring molecules together and you get substances and you get various other things. And they create neurons. You know, billions and billions of these things create neurons. And the neurons come together, and somehow magically at some point, consciousness occurs. Self-referential consciousness that has hopes and fears and dreads, you know, can perceive things in the way it does. So all these little molecules and atoms come together to create somebody who wonders what atoms and molecules are. Now that is incredible. Does it mean that just the addition of one molecule and suddenly we become conscious? Or is it gradual? Do you know? But even so, there must be that kind of point where something is completely unaware of anything. It's a stone or whatever, and then suddenly just one little thing, just one little raindrop, one little whatever brings about, oh, I'm here. I'm something perceiving something. And from then on, you can build up to then have self-referential consciousness and everything that makes us the way we are. This problem of how this comes about is called a hard problem of consciousness. And I think we've discussed it before, and it's the idea of how this happens. In my new book, I take this by the horns and I really pull at it and really try to get to the bottom of this. Because what I do in my writing is I challenge the scientists. I do the science. I don't say I'm channeling this from the planet Tharg. Everything I say is based upon research papers. It's based upon peer-reviewed papers. It's based upon New Scientist articles in books on neurology. All this information. And all I do is I take the information and pull it together and say, well, what is this telling us? And this is why a lot of materialist reductionist skeptics find my work very disturbing. Because they can't diss me. They can't dismiss the things I say. They can say that Orco-R has not been proven. Well, no, it hasn't, but it hasn't been disproven either. And until we can't get over Chalmers's hard problem of consciousness, how the brain creates consciousness, we have a problem because our science can't even begin to understand how consciousness comes about.
Well, I've got questions and points for discussions based upon your book. You know how I found you. Most of my listeners by now will know that the reason I sort of stumbled across you in the first place was because of my own experience in 2012, best described as a near-death experience that was extremely sci-fi. And the opening line, I blood pressure crash, spoke scientific information, and the first line was, everything is an illusion. It is all our perception of an infinite range of frequencies and vibrations. And I went on to speak scientifically And so much of what I said, which I've basically been researching ever since, is touched upon in your book, which for me is so exciting. And there was so many points which I've made notes of where it was like, aha, he's talking about it in his book. So my first thread of research was I tried to find back in 2012 anybody that was saying that everything is an illusion. So you go back to ancient religions and people like David Icke turned up. I heard you on a podcast talking about Philip K. Dick and the Matrix. And I was like, I've just lived this. I've had this happen. So in this book, Opening the Doors of Perception, one of the aha moments for me was, you mentioned Aldous Huxley and how he had a book called The Perennial Philosophy, where he says that truth, the real truth, is that all consciousness is a singularity and reality is an illusion. Now that for me was 1000% my experience. At the end of the experience, I felt this undeniable connection that everything is connected. That literally like the field, like George Lucas would say, the force, that is what I felt. So it sounds like that's what Aldous Huxley spoke of, and therefore you can probably expand upon that.
Very much so. The perennial philosophy, Aldous Huxley was the first person to really put this together in a logical way. But the very fact he calls it the perennial philosophy is something that has been around for centuries, for millennia. It's the realization. And I think some people never make the link, and some of us do make this link and realize that the world is far more intriguing than we can ever imagine. And the perennial philosophy is basically that, everything is consciousness, and consciousness comes from it. Now, Aldous Huxley himself, well, in fact, just going back slightly, the idea of your experience there of the oneness of everything, that experience has been known for centuries. And there was a guy called Buck who wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness way back in the 1880s, 1890s. And his work was very much about this sudden appreciation of how reality really works, and that I am part of a greater something embodied somehow into this reality that is some kind of holographic illusion. Now, again, I wrote a chapter for a book that's coming out in January called Pandeism, and it's a Pandeism reader. And it's a series of pandeists from around the world. I don't consider myself necessarily a pandeist, but I have interest in the philosophy.
What's a pandeist, and does it involve a zoo?
It doesn't usually. It probably, no, I'm not going there. I was about to go off on a spin, but I'm not going to do that. Pandeism is the idea that everything is God. Not God in the sense of the Christian sense or the Abrahamic religions. It is more the concept of God as you get in the Vedanta, or you get in Gnosticism, where if you start reading, for instance, the writings of the Sufis, if you start reading the Kabbalah and the Gnostics, the Christian Gnostics, and then you go off into the Vedanta and the idea that everything is Brahman, and everything is just one thing perceiving itself, you start to realize that the roots of every religion, every philosophical religion, is saying the same thing.
Right.
And this is, again, the Huxleyan perennial philosophy. The Kabbalah has a concept called the Or Ein Sof. The Or Ein Sof is everything that there is, the singularity. In Chinese philosophy, you have the Tao, and the Tao is everything. So it's as if many, many religions have their kind of religion for the masses. Then you have the philosophy for the people who really think, rather than the people that just want the ritual, and the real thinkers. And these are the dangerous people. This is why I would argue there was a bombing of a Sufi shrine in northern Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and 50 people were killed. It's because the fundamentalist Muslims have a great fear of their own philosophical group, which is Sufis.
Isn't in the Muslim religion, though, don't they say everything is an illusion?
Oh,
Isn't
yes.
that part of what Muhammad said? Everything is an illusion?
The idea, again, it's because it's all brain generated. It's all created. It's mind matter. Pierre de Chardin, the Jesuit philosopher, he used to talk about this as well. So you have it in all religions and you have it in all ideals. But the danger is that modern society and monotheistic religions have this cult of personality and the cult of individuality. Whereas these are the complete opposite. They're saying that if I kill somebody or I hurt somebody, I'm hurting myself. It's the idea of we are all a singularity, therefore what we do, we damage ourselves.
I subscribe to that. There's a level I feel that to be very true, that whatever as well you point a finger at and say that's wrong, the real task is to find the wrongness in yourself to make the correction.
We are here to learn. We are here to experience life, to make ourselves better human beings, and to realize the God within. God again with small g, the singularity.
Which you could also call, instead of God, so that any listeners are going, we're talking about God. You could refer to it in many ways, right? Like higher intelligence.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it.
That word, that label, that really is probably beyond labeling.
It is, and this is
beyond
why.
us.
This is why when you realize, when you read up on Taoism, and they say the Tao is everything you cannot explain. The Tao is something you cannot explain, because our brains are so hardwired for existing within this existence. There are certain things we cannot possibly really conceive of, except as a philosophical analogy. So the idea of God, I mean, I am not religious. I never have been religious, but I am spiritual.
Right.
And my interest in this has been drawn from my own readings of science and my readings of philosophy and everything else that are drawing me towards this, rather than somebody bashed my fingers together when I was a kid to believe in some nonsense, because that's not how it is. You find your own way. There are many paths up the mountain, but the view from the top is still the same.
Right.
And that is very true. We are all on a journey, and our journey is our own inner journey to finding the God within, because of course you read books on entheogens, things like dimethyltryptamine. Entheogen means the God within.
He's talking about drugs, you guys.
By the way, they are bad things. You should never take them, and they are illegal. But going back to Aldous Huxley, because this now comes round perfectly. Aldous Huxley, as well as his book, The Perennial Philosophy, in 1953, go back, 1951-52, there were two British psychiatrists called John Smithies and Humphrey Osmond. And after they formed the band and did Crazy Horses and everything else, they decided to become psychiatrists. Right. They were offered jobs at a place called the Souris Valley Hospital in southern Saskatchewan, near a town called Weybourne, which was, in fact, the biggest building in the British Empire in the 1950s. It's weird, isn't it? The biggest building in the British Empire was in a cornfield somewhere in Saskatchewan.
For mental health.
For mental health people. Yeah.
Ha!
What does that say about the world?
Yeah.
So anyway,
and Canadians.
And Canadians as well. Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you live in that flat world,
You've gone to Canada.
Yeah, I have.
We're going to start looking at your head. I can say that because I'm Canadian too. So.
That's right. My sister's Canadian. I have Canadian family as well, and I've been there a few times, so I can say it as well. No, they're great people. They're great people. God, I sounded like
so
Donald
Osmond
Trump
and Smithies. Is that the names?
Humphrey Osmond and John Smithies.
Yeah, Smithies, okay.
Smithies, or I don't know how you pronounce it, probably Smithies or something. So anyway, they both went across to this hospital, and they were dealing with people who had problems with alcoholism, and they were also dealing with people who had extreme schizophrenia. Now, Smithies, I think it was Osmond, had noticed while he was a medic in the Second World War that soldiers under extreme stress, real in battle situations, would fall asleep. You'd expect them to be hyperactive, but the opposite would happen. They'd sort of get drowsy. And he thought to himself, I wonder if there's a way of dealing with schizophrenia here. So in other words, schizophrenia is using our idea of perception. Schizophrenia, they perceive everything. Right. Everything is just light, sounds, and everything that drives them crazy. And they see hallucinations and everything else. Osmond thought to himself, a normal neurotypical person, if they take LSD or they take any psychoactive substance, will start seeing visions and everything else, but they'll never go to extremes. They'll never go crazy. Schizophrenics are right out here naturally. So if we gave a schizophrenic an hallucinogenic substance, the hallucinogenic substance might actually draw them back to the same level that a neurotypical person is when they take hallucinogenic substances.
Like how you would give in the 80s and 90s a Ritalin to a hyperactive child. Because Ritalin that would make normal brains super hyperactive would calm a hyperactive mind.
You got it exactly.
Okay.
And that was exactly their logic. And then they thought, well, what substance can we use that's legal and everything else? And most substances in those days were legal because they normally make them illegal when they realize what they can do. And they had been working with a derivative of peyote. And peyote is something you get from cacti. And it's highly hallucinogenic. And they were able to synthesize that and create it in the laboratory in a substance called mescaline. And they gave mescaline to the schizophrenics, or the people, I'd rather use the term people experiencing schizophrenia. And it drew them back. It made them less sort of difficult to understand and everything else. It seemed to work. And they wrote a paper in 1952. They wrote a paper on it. Aldous Huxley, living in LA, reads this paper. And he reads it and he thinks, this sounds really interesting. Now, Huxley himself was starting to go blind.
Was he basically a writer?
He was.
Is that what he was?
He, in the 1930s and 1940s, written a series. Brave New World is a classic example. And in Brave New World, for instance, there is a substance called soma, where people go into hallucinogenic states, and he very much said this was a bad thing.
This is fictional.
This was fictional. This was fictional. He wrote mostly fiction at that time. He emigrated to America, and while he was in America, he wrote a few more books, but became very interested in Vedanta. Now, Vedanta is, I touched upon earlier on, Vedanta is the mystical branch of Hinduism, which again believes that this is all an illusion and we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. So he was already on the route. The perennial philosophy he was interested in. He'd come across Vedanta, thought it was a wonderful concept. And Vedanta is incredible, by the way. If you check up on it, it's really, really incredible. And Vedanta had really nailed it. Okay, so he was quite interested in this. But he knew he was losing his eyesight. And he thought, I wonder if there's ways that my eyesight can be improved. And he thought, well, if I can have hallucinations, I'll see things that I can't normally see because my eyesight's breaking down. So he contacted Osmond and he said, there's a conference taking place in LA, the American Psychological Association or Psychiatric Association. Come on down. And if you can bring your mescaline with you.
Bring the goods, kids.
Bring the goods down and I'll try it. And this is what they did. They brought down 0.4 of a milligram. And he tried it out in late 1953. And he had the most amazing experience. And the experience was so powerful that it changed him forever. And he sat in his living room and he suddenly started seeing things in a far more real way. He saw almost the soul of things. He could see the detail and the beauty of everything around him. Now, I don't know if he cites this, but when I was reading his book, I was reminded of there's a guy called Jakob Boehme, who was a German mystic in the 14th or 15th century. And in one of his descriptions, he says how it was to look at a pewter dish. And he just stirred when he was in one of his religious altered states of consciousness, because he was a mystic. He saw the beauty of a pewter dish. And he said, under normal circumstances, we never see the beauty of things. And this is what happened to Aldous Huxley. So when he finished, he wrote a book on it, a short book called The Doors of Perception. He wrote this, and the title was quite specific. The title was relating back to a poem, I think, from the Songs of Innocence by William Blake, where William Blake says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see reality as it really was, infinite. But we are locked within the confines of our cave, and we are restricted.
Right.
He was also aware of the work of a French philosopher called Henri Bergson. And Henri Bergson had argued that the human brain acts as an attenuator. Its role is not to bring perception in, but to restrict broad perception.
Block it out.
Block it out, like a pair of sunglasses blocks out bright light. And his argument, but Bergson's argument, was a perfect one. The argument is, in order to survive, we have to be able to focus our attention on the things that need us to survive. If we are perceiving everything that can be perceived, we're not going to spot the saber-toothed tiger that's going to rip our throats out. So we have to attend to the things that are important. When we take certain substances, the doors of perception, the ability of the brain to attenuate the information gets broken down. And suddenly its ability to do so stops or gets stopped in some way. And we see reality as it really is. And for some of us, it drives us crazy. Now, C.D. Broad, the English philosopher, some years later made a very similar idea. And he called our everyday mind normal mind. And there is a mind at large. And the mind at large is the greater mind that we were discussing before, to start to perceive the collective consciousness.
Right.
What Jung said, because Jung said we have a consciousness and we have a collective consciousness.
Right.
The brain is normally designed to stop us understanding the greater something. And I argue that probably that's because the greater something is probably achieved after death. And that we move on to that greater something. But in normal life, we don't. Now, he wrote the book, The Doors of Perception. And it became a sensation. It became a real counterculture hit because here's this guy that was writing books that were anti-drugs, suddenly had his own experiences. And in 1961 or 62, he wrote a book, I think, called The Island. And in The Island, this society survives on hallucinogenic substances. So his role had completely and utterly changed on the way he saw the world. Now, the book became so popular in countercultural terms that Jim Morrison, when he was a lad, read the book and decided when he was going to form his band, he called them The Doors. And, of course, The Doors of Perception. And if you listen to a lot of Jim Morrison's lyrics, like Breaking On Through to the Other Side, one of their big hits, you listen to those lyrics, he's talking about breaking on through perception to something wider.
Right.
Now, since then, we have discovered that the zeitgeist and the Weltgeist are picking up on this now. You see movies now like Inception. You see movies, for instance, Interstellar.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of we broaden our perceptions of reality. And this is because it's as if society is starting, whatever guides society, collectively, it's drawing us all up to becoming aware of the perennial philosophy.
Right.
And this is happening through the culture we're in at the moment. We are more ready for this idea. We are more ready for the idea that perception, what we perceive out there can be created. I give the example at the end of the book, and I also put this in the chapter in the book on Pandeism. I say, just imagine a scenario that you can put an Oculus Rift on your head. Now, an Oculus Rift, for anybody out there who doesn't know, it's a kind of
I'm sure everybody knows what an Oculus Rift is. I mean, don't you have one in your closet?
Absolutely. You would do if you were quite wealthy. You can actually buy watered-down Oculus Rifts now, by the way.
What is an Oculus Rift?
Right. An Oculus Rift is a headset that you put on with headphones. And it's stereo. It's like a stereo viewer. And you plug it into your computer. You have to have a really, really powerful computer for it to work really well. But if anybody's interested, you can reproduce this. You can buy yourself a Google Cardboard, which will cost you about 15 quid. And if you have a new iPhone or you have a Samsung 6 or 7, you can slot it in and you can reproduce a lot of these effects I'm going to explain now. But the Oculus Rift, I'll show you later. I've actually got a device that will do it. Blow your mind. I can show you something that really will blow your mind. So you put the Oculus Rift on and you plug it into a super powerful laptop. You know, there's laptops that really this will work with cost you $3 or $4 grand. You know, really expensive.
Probably a Mac.
Probably. probably. There is something called a Predator, I think, that is the one that you buy for this. I was over in Switzerland recently with James Swager, who interviewed me, and he had one of these super-duper laptops. Never seen anything like it. It's had fans all around it because it gets so hot. Amazing thing.
Yeah.
They are amazing. Or a very, very expensive desktop. So you plug yourself in, and you can then download games and software. When you download these games and software, and you put the headset on, you are in a completely virtual reality that is all around you.
Wow.
You move your head, and you can do it with this thing I've got here. You move your head, and it accommodates your head movement.
You know how else I can do it? Right now, by looking around the room.
Exactly.
It's like I'm in this room.
It is, isn't it? The headset, the invisible headset you've got on. So imagine you've got one of these Oculus Rifts on. Imagine then that, and the technology is already there, whereby you can, for instance, you can now buy gloves that are sensitive. So in the virtual world, if you put your hands in front of you in the virtual world with the Oculus head, you will see a pair of hands that will move like your fingers move. They're working on body sets, so you can wear a body thing which will move in the three-dimensional reality. And you can walk around the three-dimensional reality. You can pick things up, you can play with them, you can do all kinds of things with them. Now, that's the technology we have now. So imagine a scenario where you could put this suit on and everything else, and then somebody had written a virtual reality game of your life.
Right.
That starts from the moment of your birth, and you are born in the suit. And then, and this is the thing I suggest in the book that is the final twist, you take a substance that wipes all your previous memories of who you were. And you start living the life in that suit, and you grow in it, and you live through your life, and you walk around in this virtual reality, which is a virtual reality version of your own life. How would you know?
Right.
And this is a big philosophical question. It's called the brain in the vat. And I'm never quite sure whether it was John Searle or there was the philosopher that came up with this. But it's the same idea. If you were a brain, somebody had taken your brain out in operation, they were able to do it, take your brain out and stick you in a vat of saline solution and then put into your visual cortex a camera and into your sound cortex, or where you process sound, you put something in there, and your feeling and your tactile and everything else. And then they place that inside a robotic head that's existing in an external reality. You would not know. How would you ever know that you were a brain in a vat? And the argument is you couldn't, you wouldn't. And we are now getting to the point where we can collectively appreciate that, whereas 30 or 40 years ago, we couldn't do that. I mean, there's an associate of mine, again, somebody you need to interview, called Jürgen Siever. Jürgen lives down in, again, he's like a hobbit. He has a little hobbit house.
I'm sure all your friends are.
There's a friend of mine, Dr. Alan Roberts, that thinks I make all these names up. He actually turns around and he says, who is this person?
Yeah, he sounds normal, Alan Roberts.
Alan is very
He's
normal.
a regular human.
He is. If you're listening to this, Alan, somebody's just called you a regular human. Do you believe that? So
Jürgen.
So Jürgen Siever, he is a computer artist. He creates digital images, and he's also an out-of-body experiencer.
Okay.
So what he's doing is he's using a virtual reality program and an Oculus Rift to reproduce what he experiences in his out-of-body experiences. And I'm hoping to go down sometime in the next few weeks to test out what he's doing.
Okay.
And it's intriguing because this really is taking things so far forward now.
Right.
In terms of what we can and cannot do.
What you were saying about that we could be living out life in the simulation, basically, isn't that also what Elon Musk, who I know this guy has a lot of money and I'm not actually sure what his job is, how he got all this money.
He's the guy behind the Tesla
That's
motor car.
right, Tesla, that's right. And he said it's like a billions to one that we are not in a computer simulation.
Yes, he has got a great deal of coverage. I hope he has referenced his sources because it'd be very unfair if he didn't. Because the source of what he's talking about is a guy called Nick Bostrom. And in 1999, Nick Bostrom wrote a paper basically putting forward the simulation argument. And in it, Bostrom's a mathematician. I think he's a Cambridge-educated mathematician, or he's based in Cambridge, I think. And he put forward the rational argument as to why it is virtually certain that we are in a simulation. And the logic goes that Moore's law, which was put forward by a guy called Moore. It's funny how these people invent things named after them, isn't it, really? You know, strange things. There's a pattern here. Einstein, for instance, Einstein's theory of relativity. How is it the chance of Einstein discovering Einstein's theory of relativity?
Are you trying to crack a
Synchronicity,
joke?
isn't it? Synchronicity. Unbelievable. So I wonder what Musk invented. No, let's not even go there. Must be a form of perfume. So I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
You were saying about his buddy had written a paper about the simulation.
Right, and Bostrom had said that...
His buddy.
Moore.
Oh, there we go, Moore's law.
Moore's law. Now, Moore was one of the founders of Intel. Okay. And in the mid-1960s, he said that the processing power of microprocessors should double every 2 years, taking into account the way science was progressing.
Right.
Also was a way of selling more Intel stuff, but beside the point. He has been proven right. I think it's gone to about 3 years now. But it's the only restrictions now are the size of the microprocessors that we can do. If you extrapolate that to around about 200 years, 300 years' time, the amount of processing power that will be available to our descendants will be phenomenal.
Right.
Now, if our descendants have all this incredible computing power, and of course a computer doesn't need to be a machine, a computer is anything that can actually work with data. So you could use other things to be computers.
You could have organic computers.
You could have organic computers.
Then.
More interestingly, again, you could have quantum computers. And quantum computers are computers that actually work in alternate realities.
Wow.
And they're working on this at the moment. Okay? So you could have amazing processing power. So there you have these people who have amazing processing power. What are they going to do with it? Well, what have we done with our amazing processing power? We've created things like Second Life. We've created virtual reality programs. We have created computer games that you can wander around a virtual environment. We have created games like No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky, check it out. If you've not seen No Man's Sky, it will blow your mind. It is an internet-based computer game that has, I think, something like 8 gazillion planets on it, all created by the program, all out there for you to explore in 3D with your Oculus Rift.
Wow.
You could go off in your spaceship, you land on this planet, it's your planet. The planet has created itself from the program. There will be creatures on that planet who will have been evolved, and the evolution of those creatures will be completely just dependent upon the environment.
So is it self-evolving within the program?
Correct.
Wow.
Self-evolving within the program.
It's like a world, basically.
It's a universe with trillions and trillions of planets. And it's already on there if you just look at it, called No Man's Sky. Okay? So we create things like No Man's Sky. But my better analogy is we create things like Second Life. Now, Second Life, 10 years ago, was profoundly popular, and it's still there now. Second Life is a virtual reality world in 3 dimensions where you can create an avatar of yourself to look like whatever you want to look like. And then you're in this virtual reality, and you can walk around and you can interface with other avatars. Now, the freaky thing here is when you encounter another avatar in Second Life, it is somebody else in front of their computer, somewhere else in the world. And you can talk to them, you can swap ideas. The person may say to you, do you know, I've discovered this incredible island. I'll take you there. And suddenly they can just take you, and you just go up in the air, fly, and you're in this other place.
Wow.
And there'll be people dancing, having a party, and there'll be other people.
This sounds like a terrible thing for relationships.
It is. There's been divorces.
Yeah, I bet.
There have been people who have secretly got married on Second Life.
You'd have an affair in a game.
And your first life partner has discovered it, and they got divorced.
Wow.
No, really seriously, it was getting quite bad.
Oh, I would imagine.
People were spending hours, because that's why it's called Second Life.
Right.
And they were living this, and they still are.
Yeah.
There's money. There is money there. There's money to be gained. You can sell. People actually sell things on Second Life. You can buy clothing on Second Life. You can buy spaceships. You can buy cars. You really need to check it out. It's quite intriguing.
Yes.
So here we have, this is what we have created. So our descendants, with this virtually unlimited mount, what would they do? Well, if they survive and there's no nuclear war and they do survive, they are going to create simulations. And somebody at some stage is going to say, do you know what? We could create an ancestor sim.
Right.
And in the ancestor sim, we could place our ancestors.
Right.
And we could, from the photographs we've got of them or the history we know of their lives, we could, like the Sims, view what they're doing.
Right.
And I could create my great-grandfather.
We could be part of a class project in 2400 or something.
Correct. And this interview is being looked at and they're going, this is dangerous. This guy could be the person that actually tweaks the fact he's in a simulation.
Yeah, this guy's exposing
What are we going to do?
Yeah.
What are we going to do?
You better watch your back.
Absolutely.
In this sim.
Because they'll come for me. So we then have the scenario that you could live a whole life in this sim. And you wouldn't know. Now, the main problem here, and this is what Musk is saying, but what Musk doesn't appreciate, and there's another writer whose name has just escaped me, who writes something called the singularity, posthumanism. And he argues that as we evolve, we're going to become more machine-like. There's going to be like artificial arms, artificial legs and everything else. And there's going to be a point where we decide, do you know, we don't need to be in this reality anymore. We can go into a digital reality, which is going to be just as real. So why bother with the external reality? Because we can create it ourselves and be in it.
I mean, I think a lot of teenagers are there now.
Exactly. So their brains are being rewired to think this way. This is why I believe that now the new generation coming up are going to get, if I could get my book underneath the noses of the kids and get them to read this book rather than playing their computer games, I'll guarantee they'll go, hey man, this guy's really got it.
Right.
Because I have, they will click straight away with teenagers and with young adults, less so with people of my generation.
Right.
Because they don't live within it. So there we have a very curious idea of the world. And with the postmodernist idea and everything else, and the posthuman and the transhumanism. But the major problem why it may not work is something called the substrate problem. And the substrate problem is, say I was able to take a computer scan of you or your brain, do a complete scan, and in the scan it has all the neurological pathways and all how the neurotransmitters work and everything else. And I copied that and I placed that into a computer program. And then I killed you. Would you be the computer program? The question is, just
maybe.
because, but could it be that because you copy your brain in your entirety, does that mean you will become sentient?
Maybe.
And of course, we're then going back to the earlier question I asked about how inanimate matter can create consciousness. Now, Ray Kurzweil is the guy, by the way, who has written this book about postmodernism and the idea of the singularity, or the point where we and machines and virtual reality become the same thing.
I mean, this is exactly what the show Humans is about right now.
So I'm being told.
Yeah, in the UK it's on Channel 4 and in America it's on AMC. I'm sure it's somewhere online, but it's exactly this. It's conscious synthetics.
Told even more so is
Westworld.
People keep messaging me on Facebook saying, my God, this happened again. Your ideas, you're again culturally tracking.
Yeah.
You're writing this book and then suddenly, bang, it's there on the television. It happened with Lost. It happened with a lot of TV series, flash forward, right through my writing career. I've written books, then suddenly somebody's done a TV series.
Right.
Which is worrying, isn't it, really? But then again, one of those things, thanks, guys, it's imitation is really great. I don't believe for 1 minute they are copying my work, by the way. I know they're not.
They might be now, though, when it's on HBO, a show about a podcaster and a brilliant writer.
That's right. And they make a whole series about it.
And their ancestors are after them because he's about to release the secrets of how the world works.
And you can imagine Natalie Gray, played by Morgan Hawkins.
Thank you, Anthony Peake, for part 1 of this 2-part conversation. As always, I will post links at thegreyescape.com to some of the stuff you've just heard about, as well as, of course, how you can learn more about Anthony, where you can get his books, that kind of stuff. If you guys are listening on iTunes, please take a moment to rate and maybe even review the show. That would be awesome. And we have a YouTube channel now, so if you know people who you might want to recommend this show to, but maybe they don't have an iPod or an iPhone, or, you know, they're not up to speed with the whole podcast world, then send them the YouTube channel, The Grey Escape. Remember, you can join us for part 2, and I know what it's like waiting for stuff. I'm horribly impatient, so I'm going to post part 2 in 2 days, so you don't have to wait long. And it's a whole nother level of nerddom. I'm serious. We've got dark matter, dark energy. You think Breaking Bad and Walter White was cool? We are going to be talking about the real Heisenberg, as well as asking the question, could you be a computer simulation? Might sound far-fetched, but not after you've heard what Anthony's got to say about it. Thank you guys so much for listening. Keep the feedback coming. You can reach me, contact@thegreyescape.com, or at the Facebook page /The Grey Escape. And I'll be back soon in part 2. Oh my gosh, it's gonna be mind expanding. I'm not kidding. If our brains are in a vat, we're gonna need a bigger vat. That's all I'm saying. Take care. I'll catch you in a couple of days right here on The Grey Escape.